Oundle is a quiet town within Northamptonshire, and within that quiet town is a tiny village called Ashton. Ashton has often been described as a place that is extremely difficult to find unless you were specifically looking for it yourself. Even those who are actively trying to find the place have struggled, but inside this tiny, unfindable village is where our story begins.
Dude, this place is literally in the middle of nowhere.
Ashton consists of only around 33 cottages with around the same total in population. The architecture of this village has remained practically untouched for over 100 years. Despite its low amount of cottages, it is surrounded by vast farmland, and during the Second World War aided in providing the county with fresh beans, potatoes, cereals and dairy. George Peach was a World War I veteran who was left partially disabled as a result of it. By 1952 he was 64 years old, but still worked as a handyman on the local estate, and lived with his 67-year-old wife Lillian, to whom he had a son called Jack. They were often described as the happiest couple in the world, and they were really well liked in their local community. George would sometimes be described as interfering, but not in a confrontational way. He would always offer assistance if he saw someone in need of help, and was a man described as being confident and just set in his ways. Lillian was described as a woman who could make friends extremely easily, but often tended to prefer her own company instead. They both resided in a small cottage, isolated from the rest of the village, known as West Lodge. Lillian was friendly with the locals, but tended to prefer staying at her own cottage most of the time, away from the rest of town.
So, the village of Ashton is down there. That's all. Village of Ashton down there. The pub, the locals, the houses, all here. West Lodge is down this singular road, completely on its own.
With such a small village with a low population, word would travel fast, and it was extremely difficult for anything to happen without the rest of the townsfolk finding out almost instantly. All eyes were on all neighbours almost all of the time, except for one particular day.
It's a very quiet village, seems just very reclusive on its own. And then at the end of this very long, secretive, singular road is the cottage.
On October the 24th, 1952, George was working on the farm with a man by the name of John Oliver. They were dealing with a pregnant cow and trying to make her as comfortable as possible. The labour didn't seem anywhere close, so at 12:30 PM George went home and didn't return for 2 hours. John found this odd at the time, but didn't question it, assuming that something had happened at home with his wife. At 5 PM, Lillian was seen hanging out her washing to dry, and an hour passed before her husband finished work. He asked John Oliver to come and get him in the night if he needed any help with the pregnant cow. He then said goodbye to his colleague Walter Brundle before heading home. George and Lillian Peach would never be seen alive again. The next morning, on October the 25th, 1952, at 9:55 AM, Lawrence Wright arrived at George and Lillian's cottage to deliver some meat, but received no answer at the door. He tried the back, but again, there was no response. Lawrence noticed that the window to their coal bunker was open, which he didn't find out of the ordinary. But what he did find peculiar was that the curtains downstairs in the cottage were all still drawn. However, he still wasn't overly concerned, believing that the couple must have simply overslept, and he returned to the centre of the village to drop the meat off at the local pub with its landlord Frank Slater. Frank had been informed previously that George hadn't shown up to work that morning, which should have been seen as strange as he was always the first to arrive. But Slater wasn't concerned and instead visited his employer, farm manager John Dockeray. He also wasn't worried and assumed that George was just ill. Declining to help investigate himself, Dockeray sent his secretary to help Slater check out West Lodge. They were completely unprepared for what they would find. The front door was unlocked, and Slater walked inside, calling out their names but receiving no response. The cottage was dark, but undeterred, he slowly crept up the stairs to meet 3 bedroom doors. One was left slightly ajar, so he entered it to find Lillian Peach in a bed, battered, covered in blood and unconscious, but still breathing. Slater quickly ran back to the village to call the police before returning to West Lodge with some help. He and a first aider tended to Lillian, keeping her as warm and comfortable as possible while they awaited help. In the meantime, they investigated the second bedroom, which was empty, before reaching the third one, which was locked. They forced their way through the door to discover George Peach lying in bed with the blanket pulled up over his body, only his head being visible, but he was covered in blood, dead. A trail of dried blood led from George to the room where his wife was found beaten. Lillian Peach was immediately rushed to Peterborough Hospital.
As you can see, it's in the middle of nowhere, completely isolated and cut off from the rest of the village. This would have been the bedroom where George was found dead. Easy access, and then they could just walk out the front door and leave unscathed. It's a sad story, but honestly, it would have been so easy for them to do.
As the cottage was searched for clues, it was discovered that a pantry window at the back was open, and one of the panes was missing, suggesting that the person had broken in this way, using a single hand to open and secure the window. There was no other disturbance in the property. The back door was locked with the key still in it. As explained, the bedroom where George was found dead was locked, and the key to the door, to this day, has never been discovered. Strangely, however, the pantry was filled with crockery, pans, and countless other cookware, and none were disturbed, suggesting that the intruder had somehow maneuvered around all of the noisy items through an extremely narrow window without making a sound in the dead of night. However, they did find fingerprints on the window. Lillian Peach unfortunately passed away hours later at 7:45 p.m. without ever regaining consciousness, never being able to make a statement on what happened or who had attacked them. The autopsies concluded that the couple were attacked by a hammer. George received blows to the head and neck, resulting in a fractured skull, but it was also shown that Lillian fought for her life. She received more damage than George, defensive wounds to her hands and arms as if she was fighting back to try to protect herself. It's believed that George died sometime between 1 and 2 in the morning. Lillian's autopsy also showed that she was awake when she was first attacked and had defended herself. It's believed that most likely George was killed in his sleep first, which may have woken Lillian, and she was then killed to keep her quiet. It is perfectly obvious from her body that the majority of the wounds were caused by a hammer type of instrument, but this stab wound clearly indicates that there was some sort of spike or similar arrangement on the other side of the hammer, and from Peach's body I would favour the use of such instrument as a tiler's hammer, or type of hammer used by bricklayers in tapping home bricks. The degree of violence would indicate that you have either a person of extraordinarily well developed physique, or a person of moderate physique wielding a heavy weapon. The couple had a coal bunker which would normally house a coal hammer, which could have been the murder weapon. However, the window to the bunker was open and there was no hammer, which was extraordinarily strange for this local community. The village's primary source for fuel was coal, so every cottage needed to have a hammer in order to break it all down. Not having one was extremely suspicious. George and Lillian's son Jack lived in Middlesex at the time, and he hadn't seen his parents since August, 2 months prior. He had, however, moved in with George and Lillian in West Lodge along with his wife Joan and their daughter temporarily between 1950 and early 1952. He moved back out not long before the murders took place, but Jack knew the ins and outs of the family life in the cottage and was therefore able to helpfully aid in the entire investigation. Word quickly spread amongst the village, who were understandably in complete shock. Only 33 people lived in Ashton at the time, and they would have noticed an outsider hanging around, suggesting that it was in fact a local in this quiet, innocent village who had committed this crime. But weirdly, as soon as investigators came in to start questioning, the villagers went completely quiet. Ashton was put on full lockdown. Nobody was to leave or enter the area without permission, but the townsfolk suddenly became reluctant to talk to anyone. Everybody became a suspect.
Just from being here, you can get a sense that, I mean, this this house is completely isolated from the rest of the village. It is not surprising that somebody was able to sneak in, commit a murder, and then just walk away scot-free. I actually struggled to find the West Lodge cottage, and that's following it on a map. So definitely this was someone who, either it was a random act, I think, who just I was going to say wanted to rob the place, but they didn't. Wanted to commit a crime, stumbled across the cottage randomly, performed it and then ran, or it was someone who was familiar with the owners of the cottage and the village. But yeah, it's just all very, very surreal.
Watchman William Underwood was one of the last people near the cottage on the night of the murder. He passed by at around 10 PM and noticed that none of the lights in the cottage were on. A chauffeur called Christopher would also pass by an hour later, and the lights were still off. At 12:30 AM, 2 male estate workers had arrived in the village. These were the final known people to have been out in Ashton that night. They were Francis Mahoney and Frederick Hadman. They got their cattle in their pens before having a short conversation and leaving for their respective homes at around 12:45 AM. Both claimed to have not heard or seen anything out of the ordinary that night. None were considered possible suspects.
And then back to the village, so far away where nobody would have heard or seen a thing. Especially back in the 50s, this would have been one of the easiest crimes to have committed. And yeah, we will probably never know what happened.
George had been paid on the day before, and the couple didn't bank their money, but this cash wasn't found on him, suggesting that the killer had stolen it. The exact amount varies from different accounts, but it was a mere total between £7 and £9. What makes this stranger is that the couple had savings of around £200 in their cottage, which hadn't been touched. The entire village was searched, every leaf and blade of grass overturned, every bush and tree searched, and nothing was found. It's worth noting that only the men in the village were checked for fingerprints, and none matched those found on the pantry window. It wasn't until November the 1st, a week later, when local Florence Marsh from a nearby farm discovered a hammer covered in blood in the cabbage patch of her garden, just 600 yards away from George and Lillian's cottage. And it also had human hair on it, which matched George Peach. Fingerprints were found on the hammer, which also matched the ones on the window. But strangely, Florence claimed to have found the hammer on top of leaves instead of under them, despite it being over a week since the deaths. Furthermore, it's extremely unlikely that the authorities, as detailed as their initial search was, would have missed such an obvious clue, suggesting that the perpetrator had dumped this evidence after the search and was still local.
So this is where the weapon was found, which, as you can see on the map, is a pretty big distance from the cottage. But it is on the way out of the village, so it is possible that the person committed the murder and just dashed it and ran.
Francis Mahoney claimed to have found another unidentified coal hammer in his car, and a third one was found inside his coal shed that he denied owning, but nothing ever came of this. It's unclear if more than one hammer was used for the assault, though some believe whoever did it may have planted these additional hammers as a way to try to frame someone else. Mahoney did, however, leave the village before the year was out. Up to 1,000 men were questioned from the nearby areas, as well as their fingerprints being taken, but none matched the ones found at the scene of the crime. Furthermore, 2 suspicious-looking men took a train from Peterborough to London at 2:45 AM on the morning of the murders. They were described as looking flushed and panicking. One of them reportedly had a handkerchief tied around his left wrist with blood seeping through it. These men were never located again. But it's worth noting that Peterborough is 12 miles away from Ashton, and whoever did this didn't have a form of transport. There were tyre and bicycle tracks found leading to and from the cottage, but they all belonged to local people and their local vehicles. If it was an outsider, they used no transportation.
I think the fact that everyone in the village was fingerprinted, there wasn't a lot of people who lived in the village. And I mean, there were no signs of transport of from people that that lived in the village. So the person would have had to walk to freedom, which, I mean, I'm doing it right now, but I'm parked down there, so I have a car. But I don't know. Would it have been possible to walk? I mean, just looking on a map, this is smack dab in the middle of nowhere. It isn't impossible. I don't know. It's just the fingerprints it's a case. It's one of them cases that you go back and forth, because you either see it as it must have been someone in the village because they didn't notice an outsider, and because no one owned a vehicle that was indifferent, was, you know, unique to the trail found at the scene of the crime, meaning it would have had to be someone who lived in the village, or they did it all and then left on foot. Both cases seem implausible, especially when, again, sorry to reiterate, but everyone in the village had the fingerprints checked and none of them matched the crime scene. So I'll leave it for you guys to decide.
One lorry driver claimed to have been driving along the A605 on the night of the murders, when a group of 6 people were by the side of the road. A woman, who looked to be about 45 years of age and looking agitated, ran out in front of him to try to get him to stop. The driver panicked and swerved to miss her, but kept on driving. This group was never found again, but it's unclear what their motive was: innocent hitchhikers or desperate for a quick getaway. Not far from the village was Polebrook Camp. It was built for the Royal Air Force at the start of the war. By 1952, it was used to house immigrant labour. It was home to Ukrainian, Polish, Scottish and English labourers, but they were paid very little. They were also given jobs at Molesworth Aerodrome nearby, where a bus would take them every morning and drop them back off again at 5:30 PM. These people would have been strangers to the Ashton area, unfamiliar with the locals or their traditions, and would have been extremely desperate for money. This camp was actually visited on October the 26th, 1952, to try to find if any of the 36 strong labourers were missing on the night of the murders, and there was Nikolaus Skoropay. The hostel required many people to sleep in the same room together, so any movement would be pretty noticeable by their roommates. Skoropay's roommate, Alfred Nimero, claimed that on the afternoon before the bodies were found, Nikolaus Skoropay borrowed a bicycle and left the camp at around 6:30 PM, not returning until 6 AM the next morning. He was the only one missing from the hostel. Scorapay was brought in for questioning, and he claimed to have gone to a dance at the Drill Hall until 1 o'clock in the morning. He was able to name everyone he had met there, danced with, or bought drinks for, who confirmed his story, but he struggled to explain why it took him a further 5 hours to cycle a short 5 miles home. He explained his slow movements by being intoxicated, and he also claimed that he fell down and passed out on his way back. However, the weather was cold and windy and seemed unlikely to have allowed a man to sleep outside. He also claimed that the chain on his bike had broke, so he had to push it a lot of the way back as well. His alibi was questioned, though others defended him, suggesting that it would have been impossible to have committed the murders and left the village quietly without being seen whilst drunk, especially considering he would have had to enter a small pantry window quietly and leave again undetected. Furthermore, they would have broken into the coal bunker, stole the hammer, then broke in through the pantry to commit the murder. Regardless, his belongings were taken away for forensic analysis. The severity of the crime scene would have meant that the killer would have been completely covered in blood. Once Scorapay's clothes returned from forensic analysis, they concluded that there were some odd spots of blood, but nothing else, and he was ruled out as a suspect. On November the 13th, a small purse was found on the bank of a road leading out of Ashton, just 800 yards away from the cottage and not far from where the hammer was discovered. This purse belonged to Lillian Peach. This is another piece of evidence that was out in the open and most likely would have been discovered in the previous searches, leading some to again suggest that the killer was still around and dumping them recently. The positioning of the purse led investigators to believe that it perfectly aligned with the route to the hostel where Scorapay was living at the time, and he was brought back in as a potential suspect. However, after more questioning, nothing new was revealed and he was again let go with no evidence to convict him of these crimes. The police were still running with the burglary theory, despite there being no signs of a search inside the house. Furthermore, the community was quiet and trusting, so much so they all left their front doors unlocked. George and Lillian did this that night. There was no need to break in, but the killer still allegedly climbed through the pantry window at the back of the house. After murdering the couple, they then fled out of the unlocked front door. A local would have known that the door wasn't locked, and as explained, the village is one that isn't particularly easy to locate either, which makes this case even more confusing. However, it was believed that the person was probably someone they knew, as they seemed to know the layout of the house and at least the local area. After this incident, the townsfolk began always locking their doors. However, everybody was so friendly, it's believed that theft was also an unlikely theory, as everyone knew each other and felt comfortable enough to ask to borrow anything without issue, including money. It's believed that George knew something about the farms in the area, and he was incredibly angry over it. Supposedly, he had discovered that the farmers were giving the cattle small doses of poison to make them ill, so they could then be sold on the black market. George had angrily vented to a friend about it, Miriam Lane. Some locals believed this was enough reason to want George dead, as he was threatening to expose some of this fraudulent activity. Another theory is that the perpetrator broke in, believing that this cottage was owned by a much more wealthy couple, and fled when they couldn't find more money or valuables. They may have murdered the couple as a way to not raise an alarm to the locals. This again is ruled out, as not a massive search was done, and nothing in the cottage was out of place. Most believe George was targeted for wanting to leak the illegal activity on the farm, and Lillian was silenced out of panic. They then may have taken a few items to try to give off the illusion of a burglary before leaving the premises. George and Lillian Peach were buried together in Fotheringhay on November the 7th, 1952. George's watch was stolen, and his jeweller who had repaired it months earlier gave a detailed description of it, in hopes that it would be identified somewhere. On November the 8th, 1952, just a day after the couple were buried, two men appeared at a jeweller shop on Bedford High Street. One entered and asked them to repair the outer case, which was done. He then left the shop to show it to the other man, who checked it over. The first man then re-entered and requested for the face to be repainted. He was, however, informed that this would just be too difficult to do, and they both left. The manager promptly reported this incident to the police. He described them as looking unkempt and rough, unlike those who would own a pocket watch, but they were never found again. In January 1953, hundreds of men were fingerprinted around the area to try to find a match, and 5,000 people gave interviews, but nothing that could assist the investigation turned up. In 1956, 4 years after the murders, the police received an anonymous phone call about the killer.
There's someone in the fairground at Tottenham who knows quite a lot about the unsolved murder in Northamptonshire 4 years ago.
Despite the obscurity of the call, the police immediately headed to Tottenham. Upon investigating, they took 100 fingerprints from all of the male workers, who all obliged and none took offence to doing so, though none matched those at the crime scene, and no worker admitted to even being in the Northamptonshire area in 1952. Who killed George and Lillian Peach? What would drive someone to break in and assault this friendly old couple in such a quaint, quiet, civilized village? Was it a random act from a random stranger? Or was it a calculated attack from someone they knew and trusted who got away with murder? And did the police miss a vital clue by only interrogating men? This innocent couple were murdered nearly 70 years ago, and we continue seeking answers.